Tiwa's life had been turned upside down when her parents died in a tragic car accident. Left with no family and nowhere to go, she wandered the streets for days, hungry and alone. Each night, she found shelter wherever she could, but the gnawing hunger in her stomach was a constant reminder of her dire situation. One chilly evening, as Tiwa wandered the dimly lit streets, she stumbled upon a small park. Exhausted and shivering, she found a bench to rest on. As she wandered in the streets, she saw a note handwritten advert pinned to a lamppost. It read, "Nanny needed. Apply within." Desperate for a chance to change her circumstances, Tiwa decided to apply for the job. She followed the address on the advert and found herself standing in front of a charming little house. Nervously, she knocked on the door. A kind-looking woman named Mrs.Ojoe opened the door and welcomed her inside. After a brief interview, Mrs.Ojoe saw the determination and kindness in Tiwa's eyes and decided to give her a chance. Tiwa was hired as a nanny to care for a beautiful baby named. Mrs. Ojo, Ayo's mother, worked as a teacher at a nearby school. This was Tiwa's first job as a nanny, and she was excited to look after the adorable baby. Mrs. Ojo was a single parent. Her husband had tragically passed away when she was 3 months pregnant. Despite the sorrow of losing her husband, the baby growing inside her gave her immense comfort and strength. From the moment Tiwa cradled Ayo in her arms, a profound sense of purpose and hope blossomed within her, feelings she hadn't experienced in a long time. She devoted all her love and care to nurturing the baby, and in return, Ayo's innocent smiles and laughter brought immense joy to her heart. Days turned into weeks, and Tiwa became an integral part of the household. She took care of Ayo with unwavering dedication, ensuring the baby was always happy and well-fed. Mrs. Ojoe noticed the positive change in Tiwa and was grateful for the love and care she provided to her child. Tiwa's life had taken a turn for the better. She had found a new family and a place where she belonged. The pain of losing her parents was still there, but the love she received from Ayo and Mrs. Ojoe helped her heal. Tiwa felt a deep sense of fulfillment and joy as she played with Ayo, her laughter filling the room with warmth. The bond between them grew stronger each day, and Tiwa cherished every moment spent with the baby. When Ayo napped, Tiwa diligently took care of the household chores, finding a rhythm in the routine that brought her a sense of peace and accomplishment. However, a strange mystery began to unfold. Every time Tiwa prepared a bottle of milk for Ayo and left it on the kitchen table, it would mysteriously disappear by the time she returned to feed the baby. At first, she thought she might have misplaced it, but as it happened repeatedly, she grew more puzzled and concerned. The kitchen, usually a place of order and predictability, now held an air of intrigue and uncertainty. Tiwa couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual was happening, and she was determined to uncover the truth behind the vanishing milk. As Tiwa pondered the mystery of the disappearing milk, her mind raced with possibilities. She retraced her steps meticulously, recalling each moment, from when she prepared the bottle to when she returned to find it gone. Was she simply forgetting where she placed it? Or was there something more unusual at play? She considered the layout of the kitchen, thinking about any hidden nooks or crannies where the bottle might have slipped. Could it be an animal sneaking in? But how would it manage to take the bottle without leaving a trace? The thought of a mischievous spirit crossed her mind, but she quickly dismissed it, feeling a bit silly for even considering such an idea. Tiwa's curiosity grew stronger with each incident. She decided to set a small trap, placing the bottle in the same spot and hiding nearby to observe. Her heart pounded with anticipation as she waited, determined to catch the culprit. She felt a mix of excitement and apprehension, wondering what she might discover. As she waited, her thoughts drifted to Ayo. She couldn't let anything jeopardize the baby's well-being. The mystery had to be solved, not just for her peace of mind, but for Ayo's safety. With renewed resolve, Tiwa focused on the task at hand, ready to uncover the truth behind the vanishing milk. The kitchen was a cozy, well-organized space filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the faint scent of lavender from a nearby diffuser. Tiwa positioned herself outside looking from the window, her eyes fixed on the kitchen table where the bottle of milk sat. The table was neatly set with a vase of fresh flowers adding a touch of color to the room. As she waited, the ticking of the wall clock seemed louder than usual, each second stretching out as her anticipation grew. The kitchen, usually a place of routine and predictability, now felt charged with a sense of mystery and suspense. Tiwa's heart raced as she listened intently for any unusual sounds, her mind alert and ready to catch any movement. The atmosphere was a mix of tranquility and tension, the familiar environment now holding an air of intrigue. Tiwa's determination to solve the mystery was palpable, her senses heightened as she remained vigilant, ready to uncover the secret behind the disappearing milk. Just when she began to think that no one would come for the bottle, she suddenly saw tiny hands reaching up toward the counter, her breath caught in her throat as she watched in astonishment. The small hands grasped the edge of the counter, and she saw a figure climbing up. It was a very short old man dressed in baby clothes, clothes identical to Ayo's. Climbing onto the counter, it was as if they were twins wearing the same blue-colored onesie. He moved with surprising agility, his eyes fixed on the bottle of milk with a smile. Tiwa's heart raced as she realized she had finally caught the mysterious milk thief in the act. As the old man climbed onto the counter, his expression was a mix of determination and mischief. His eyes, though small and sunken, sparkled with a playful glint, as if he were enjoying a secret game. His mouth was set in a focused line, but the corners twitched upwards in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. There was a sense of urgency in his movements, yet he seemed oddly at ease, as if this peculiar act was something he had done many times before. The contrast between his aged, wrinkled face and the childlike glee in his eyes created an eerie yet fascinating sight, leaving Tiwa both intrigued and unsettled. Tiwa could hardly believe what she was seeing. Her heart raced with a mix of fear and disbelief as she watched the old man, dressed in baby clothes, climb onto the counter. She felt a surge of adrenaline, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Should she try to catch the dwarf and tie him up? Or should she focus on collecting evidence, like a video, or show Mrs.Ojoe? Determined to uncover the truth, Tiwa knew she had to show Mrs.Ojoe what was happening. She felt a strong sense of urgency and resolve, knowing that this bizarre situation needed to be addressed. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, ready to capture the scene. The strange sight before her was almost too surreal to comprehend, but she steeled herself, knowing that she had to act quickly and decisively. That evening, when Mrs.Ojoe returned home, Tiwa was still reeling from the bizarre incident she had witnessed. She couldn't stop thinking about what she saw. She approached Mrs.Ojoe with a mix of urgency and hesitation. "Mrs.Ojoe, I need to tell you something," Tiwa said, her voice trembling slightly as she recalled the strange sight. Mrs.Ojoe looked at her with concern. "What is it, Tiwa?" Taking a deep breath, Tiwa explained what she had seen. "There's something very unusual happening. Every time I prepare a bottle of milk for Ayo and leave it on the kitchen table, it disappears. Today I saw a very short old man dressed in baby clothes, sneaking into the kitchen and drinking the milk." Mrs.Ojoe's eyes widened in disbelief. "What do you mean there's a dwarf drinking my baby's milk?" she asked, clearly confused and skeptical. "Where is this old short man coming from? I know it sounds unbelievable, but please, come home during your lunch break tomorrow and see for yourself," Tiwa urged. The following morning, Mrs.Ojoe returned home during her lunch break, still doubtful but willing to see what Tiwa was talking about. Tiwa had prepared a bottle of milk and placed it on the kitchen counter. She then asked Mrs.Ojoe to watch through the kitchen window with her. Mrs.Ojoe, though skeptical, agreed. They both stood by the window, peering into the kitchen. As the minutes ticked by, Mrs.Ojoe grew increasingly impatient. "Are you sure about this, Tiwa?" she whispered. "Just watch and be patient," Tiwa replied, her eyes fixed on the kitchen. Suddenly, they saw tiny hands reaching up to the counter. Mrs.Ojoe's eyes widened in shock as the old man, dressed in baby clothes, identical to Ayo's, climbed onto the counter. It was as if they were twins, wearing the same pastel-colored onesie with little ducklings printed on it. The sight was surreal and unsettling, the old man's wrinkled face and gray hair contrasting sharply with the infant attire. The resemblance in their clothing made the scene even more bizarre, leaving Mrs.Ojoe is utterly speechless and overwhelmed by the strange reality unfolding before her eyes. Mrs.Ojoe was so stunned by what she saw that she fainted on the spot. After Mrs.Ojoe fainted from the shock of seeing the old man in baby clothes drinking the milk, she was rushed to the hospital along with her baby, Ayo. Mrs.Ojoe's mind was consumed by the terror when she finally woke up in hospital from what she had witnessed. The sight of the old man, dressed identically to her baby, haunted her thoughts day and night. The story quickly spread through the town, becoming a chilling legend that people whispered about in hushed tones. It was a reminder of the mysterious and unexplainable events that had unfolded within her home. As the gossip spread, the townspeople were divided. Some believed that Mrs.Ojoe knew more than she was letting on, suspecting her of hiding some dark secret. Others felt sympathy for her, convinced that she was an innocent victim of an inexplicable phenomenon. But one could explain the reason or come up with a solution to help Mrs.Ojoe. The constant speculation and judgment weighed heavily on Mrs.Ojoe, deepening her sense of isolation. The stress and fear took a severe toll on her mental health. She fell into a deep depression, Unable to shake the images of the old man and the unsettling events, she became withdrawn, avoiding social interactions and retreating into herself. The bond she once had with Ayo began to fray. She couldn't bring herself to hold or feed her baby, overwhelmed by the fear and confusion that now dominated her life. The once vibrant and dedicated teacher was now a shadow of her former self, struggling to find a way back to normalcy. The legend of the old man and the baby lingered in the town, a constant reminder of the strange and terrifying events that had forever changed Mrs. Ojoe's life. The nurses, having heard the bizarre tale, were terrified to feed Ayo, fearing that the milk would somehow transform the baby into the old man they had heard about. Despite their fears, they had to care for Ayo, but they handled the baby with extreme caution. Weeks turned into months, and Mrs. Ojoe's fear and detachment grew. She became deeply depressed and didn't want to touch her child. The doctor thought it may be postnatal depression. She just laid there as the baby cried. The baby's cries became weaker and more desperate, echoing through the hospital halls like a haunting melody. The nurses did their best to comfort Ayo, but the baby's health began to deteriorate. The nurses, already on edge, found their fears amplified by the constant stream of visitors and the relentless gossip. Each time they prepared a bottle of milk for Ayo, they did so with trembling hands, their eyes darting around the room as if expecting the old man to appear at any moment. They fed Ayo in shifts, ensuring that no one was alone with the baby for too long. The hospital staff whispered among themselves, their fear growing with each passing day. The once lively and vibrant baby became frail and listless. The nurses, despite their initial fear, grew increasingly concerned for Ayo's well-being. On one fateful morning, Mrs. Ojoe was beginning to slowly accept her baby, Ayo, as he was the only reminder of the love she had shared with her late husband. She spent the night by Ayo's side, finding solace in his presence. As dawn broke, she woke up to an eerie silence that sent a chill down her spine. Rushing to Ayo's cot, her heart pounded with a sense of foreboding. When she reached the cot, she found Ayo lifeless, his tiny body still and cold. Her heart shattered into a million pieces, and she collapsed in grief, her sobs echoing through the silent room. But as she looked closer, her sorrow turned to horror. Lying next to Ayo's tiny body was an old, frail man, his face deeply wrinkled and his eyes closed as if in eternal sleep. The sight was both surreal and terrifying, leaving Mrs. Ojoe paralyzed with fear and confusion. The room, once filled with the promise of a new day, now felt like a scene from a nightmare, forever altering the course of her life. Mrs. Ojoe screamed, and the nurses came running. They were equally shocked by the sight. The old man who had somehow taken Ayo's place was a mystery that no one could explain. A nurse called Grace rushed to Ayo's cot and picked up the baby's lifeless body as her heart broke. She cradled the tiny body, tears streaming down her face. The hospital was shrouded in silence, and the nurse decided to take matters into her own hands to revive Ayo's life, back using her nursing skills. Suddenly, the baby's heartbeat was back to normal as the machine started beeping. Tiwa and Mrs. Ojoe were filled with excitement. With a heavy heart, she prepared a bottle of milk and sat by Ayo's cot, gently feeding the baby. As she did, she whispered soothing words, hoping to bring some comfort to the child. To her surprise, nothing unusual happened. Ayo drank the milk and fell into a peaceful sleep. Grace felt a glimmer of hope and continued to care for Ayo with renewed determination. Grace shared her experience with the other nurses, and slowly, their fear began to dissipate. The hospital staff and Mrs. Ojoe were left with more questions than answers. Mrs. Ojoe realized that there was a force that made her not pay attention to her own baby. Tiwa continued to take care of Ayo while she also went to night school, which Mrs. Ojoe paid for. Today, she is a graduate working at the hospital where Ayo's life was saved. Ayo is now preparing for university on a scholarship. This strange event made Mrs. Ojoe help Tiwa, who was no longer just a nanny but became a member of her family. At times, we may not know, but people come into our lives for a reason. Thank you for watching Granny G's stories. Please don't forget to subscribe for more stories.